Yeah. All right. All right. So this portion is Vayetze, which means "and he went out." It covers Genesis 28:10 to 32:3. So to recap the portion, last week we saw Jacob lied to his blind dad, and that's how he got his blessing. Not really good. Esau wasn't very happy with that, and he wanted to kill him. So his mom told him to run away and go to her homeland, and he did that. And as he was going, he rested at one place, and he saw this vision of this stairway to heaven. And most likely it was a ziggurat. They didn't have spiral staircases back then, so that's probably what he saw in his vision. And then after that, he sees Rachel, and he gets very emotional about it. And he wants to marry her, and he does this whole deal with Laban. He's like, "Look, I'll work for you 7 years to marry her," which is crazy. But he does it, and then after 7 years, he ends up with the other sister. And then there's this huge thing with him and Laban, like, "Hey, man, what's up? What's going on?" So he works another 7 years for Rachel, and then this whole chaotic thing starts spiraling downwards. And that's kind of where things start going down south when it comes to the people in the Bible. Because if you notice from Abraham, he has like direct communication with God. And then as you go down descendants, like God is not as involved anymore, and like crazier and crazier stuff starts happening. So that's how it ends. But this whole Torah portion is actually an adoption story. But it's not a good one. But it is an adoption story, and a lot of people don't really understand the concept of adoption in the Bible. It's actually very important to explain a lot of things. I noticed that we haven't actually talked about this concept in a very long time. I think the last time we did was in 2022. So it's been a couple years. But adoption is going to be everywhere in the Bible. We see it with Moses. That's like the most obvious one, with him and the daughter of Pharaoh. But it's also going to be with Ephraim and Manasseh, with Jacob and Laban, with Lot and Abraham. Those are all adoption stuff. Yeshua, adoption is going to be very involved with him and his whole gospel. And then also in the New Testament, with a lot of the scriptures in Galatians or Romans or Ephesians, it all has to do with adoption. So if you really want to understand the Bible, you got to understand how adoption worked back then. So for this lesson, we're going to talk about the purpose of adoption in ancient Near East. We're going to talk about Jacob and Laban. And then we're going to look at adoption and suzerain vassal covenants. And then we'll look at Yeshua and why did he have to get baptized. I don't know if you guys ever asked yourself that. Like, why did he have to get baptized? He was already the Son of God, right? So why does he have to get baptized? But there's a reason why. And then we'll look at adoption in the first century Rome. Like, why did they adopt people? And then we'll look at New Testament verses after studying that. So a lot of people out there believe that the Holy Bible in the English translation is enough. That the KJV Bible, that's all you need to read. I don't need to learn the Hebrew. I don't need to learn the ancient Near Eastern stuff because, the English translation is divinely inspired. Or they'll tell you, the word is straightforward. I don't have to learn Hebrew. I just got to read what it says there, and that's it. But if you remember from Raquel's teaching, we talked about Hesed. Hesed in the translation is usually mercy. But she showed that mercy is not really the proper word. It's not good enough. It kind of gets a little bit what Hesed is, but you're not really getting the full definition of Hesed. How many of you guys here speak Spanish? Right? Good. Let's say you hear a very funny Spanish joke, right? And then you try to explain to somebody who speaks English. How hard is that? It's very hard, right? Because then, one, it's not going to be funny anymore. And then you have to understand certain words. And then also it's a cultural thing. Like my mom, she loves watching these Colombian novellas. But a lot of the jokes are for Colombians. I'm not really Colombian. So I don't really get the jokes. So a lot of the jokes are cultural, or you have to learn certain words. So when you start going from one language to another, you lose a lot of meaning. Same thing with the Hebrew. When you move from Hebrew to English, you're going to lose a lot of the original meaning. And there's a lot of things that are not in the English that are not there directly. And that is adoption. Adoption is a word that you don't really find in the Old Testament, but it exists. And that's because in the ancient Near East, they didn't have a word for adoption. They have phrases, they have expressions, but they don't have a single word that describes adoption. But they did practice it back then. So we're going to look at the purposes of adoption in ancient Near East. So I want you to think, why would a person adopt today? And then when you think of the word adopt, what words come to your mind? So I'll give you like a minute or so to think about that, and you can write it down on your board, and then we'll go through that. And there's no trick answers, so you can put whatever you think. It's fun. And you don't have to tell everybody. It's a private thing, okay? Let me see what you guys got. Nice. Let me see what you get down. I got you. I know what you mean. Let me see, what do you put? Help kids. Orphans, kindness. Fertility. People are just nice. I guess. Let me see, what else do you guys put? What do you have? Kids. That's true.
I wasn't talking about like adopting like another language or something.
No. Like literal adoption. Yeah. Okay. What did you put? Kids and can't have kids. A lot of people put that. What did you put? Let's see. Infertility. Just want to give a child a home, family, orphanage, social worker. Let me see. What do you, Obed? You raised it? You got nervous? Oh, what did you write? What's your name again?
Porter.
What was it?
Porter.
Porter? Nice to see you again. We put ownership, child, and what was it? Orphanage? Okay. Well, I think most of you guys already answered. So a lot of you guys put kids, right? Everybody thinks about kids with adoption. Maybe some of you think about, having a family, making a family. Some might think about love, having a home. And somebody put social worker. Yeah, it's true because it involves paperwork. You can't just go to an orphanage and be like, hey, I want that one. That's child trafficking. You can't do that. So it is a legal process, and it is to have a kid and give them a home, and there's a lot of reasons why we adopt today, but it's very different than back then. So if we talk about the firstborn in the ancient Near East, like Joseph, he was the firstborn. What was it? Firstborn of Rachel, but the firstborn blessing could be picked. You didn't have to be the firstborn. I could choose whoever I wanted to. So the firstborn would receive an inheritance from their father, and then they would become the clan leader. So they would get all the stuff, the flock, the wealth. He would be the head of the clan, so he would be the big honcho. But also, he would have the responsibility to care for his elderly parents and make sure that they had the proper burial. That was the responsibility of the firstborn. So when Esau gives away his blessing, it's not just him saying, whatever. He's also telling his parents, I don't really care. Like, I'm not going to make sure that you guys are taken care of. I'm just really hungry. Give me that soup, So it was actually a big statement that he made. So again, we adopt today to help kids or to have kids in your house. Back then, they didn't really adopt kids. They would actually get an adult. Like, for example, let's say I'm a 60-year-old man. I have no kids. And I want somebody to take care of me because there's no nursing homes back then. So if I'm old and have nobody to take care of me, either I become a slave or who knows what happens. So I would go and I would get Andrew, and we would do like a contract. So we would form a contract between me and him. I'd be like, look, I'm going to adopt you as my son. I know it's a little bit weird, but I'm going to adopt you as my son, and you're going to take care of me when I get old. And in return, you're going to have my inheritance when I die. So you're going to get my house, my land, my flock. You're going to get all that stuff. And also, I find you a wife. And that's the part that seals the contract. Once you get married to that wife that I found you, that is the seal of that contract. And then in return, like I said, you take care of me. That's the deal. Now, if I had my own son, naturally, now you don't have the firstborn blessing anymore. That's going to go to my actual son. But you guys are going to split the inheritance. So you still get some of the inheritance, even though now you don't have the firstborn blessing. Okay? And the way that you could forfeit that contract or break that contract was if Andrew went and married somebody else. So instead of marrying the person that I gave him, he married somebody else, and that breaks the contract. And that's going to be very important for this portion. So we got to look at some clues in this portion. So clue number 1, Rachel was shepherding her father's sheep. That was something that was not very common back then. It's not 2024. It was pre-Yeshua. So they didn't really send out their daughters to do shepherding. Usually it was the sons. Because back then, it was a very dangerous world. If you send out any woman by themselves, most likely things would not go that great. There's no cell phones. Nobody can find out if you're okay. So it wasn't really smart to send out your daughter by themselves. But that's because most likely Laban didn't have any sons. So that's clue number 1. And then clue number 2, if we read this portion, if somebody could read it for me. Kaden, are you raising your hand?
There's a giant mosquito by my face. It's huge.
So can you read it?
Okay. As soon as Laban heard the news about Jacob, his sister's son, he hurried to meet him. He embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his home. And there Jacob told him all these things. Then Laban said to him, "You are my own flesh and blood."
Right, so that language he's saying, "You are my flesh and blood," is typical adoption language. In a lot of the contracts of adoption, they'd always say stuff like, "You are my son," "You are my father," very common language. So this is a supporting detail that shows that there's an adoption contract between Jacob and Laban. And then if somebody else could read this.
After Jacob had stayed with him for a whole month, Laban said to him, "Just because you are a relative of mine, should you work for me for nothing? Tell me what your wages should be." Jacob was in love with Rachel and said, "I'll work for you 7 years in return for your younger daughter, Rachel."
So we see that Laban is giving him a wife. They're forming a contract between each other. So again, this is very similar to the adoption contracts from back then. So again, more supporting detail that this is an adoption thing. And then if we read later on, I'll read this one. It says, Jacob heard that Laban's sons were saying, "Jacob has taken everything for our father owned and has gained all this wealth from what belonged to our father." And Jacob noticed that Laban's attitude toward him was not what it had been. So now we see that Jacob has sons. If he adopted Jacob, what would happen to the inheritance?
Split up.
They'd have to split it, right? So he would have to split it, and it's a legal obligation. So he can't just be like, "Well, we're not going to do it." They're legally obligated to split it with Jacob. So if Laban didn't want to split the inheritance, what could he do?
Unadopted?
Give them a different one.
Well, you can't. Once you're adopted, that's it. Well, what did we just talk about? If you wanted to forfeit the inheritance,
Switch the wives.
if I marry somebody else and the person you gave me, then the contract is void. So that's why we have that whole thing with Rachel and Leah. That's why he gives Leah. He gives us an excuse like, "Well, here in this land, we always do the firstborn first," but he was lying. He did it in front of a bunch of people, so there's witnesses. He gave the wrong person. So now he could say in front of everybody, "Well, he didn't keep his part of the bargain, so that contract is void." So he tricked Jacob. And we've seen Laban before. He's kind of a shifty kind of guy. When Eliezer went over there and they tried to get more money out of him? He said he's that type of guy, so it's not surprising. So we learn a lot from this portion when we look at it through adoption. And adoption, again, is not really an emotional thing back then. It's very legal. It's for legal purposes to establish, this person is going to be under my household. He's going to take care of me. And in return, he gets the stuff. It's very, very legal. And that's what you have to think about when you look at adoption in the suzerain vassal covenants. So if I ask you, when did God speak to Moses at the burning bush? Was it before or after Pharaoh died?
Like the first row?
Well, you can read it. Read Exodus 2:1 to 3:2 and let me know. So if you have your Bible and you want to read that and look for that. You guys don't have your Bibles? Get your phone, yeah, anything. Share with people too.
You talking about the first Pharaoh or second Pharaoh? Like, they're both Pharaoh, but one was the father, one was the
Well, technically it would be the
No.
first one.
first one.
Is that your notebook? What? I'm proud. To make it easy, it's at the end of chapter 2, so you don't have to read the whole chapter. Hold it.
I'm writing it down.
You want to share with him, Porter, so he can read it? See, so I feel like everybody's read it. So was it before or after he died?
After.
After? Why?
Because.
Why do you think? Why do you
I
think?
think because like Pharaoh was his father, so he kind of doesn't have a father anymore. In a way.
Okay, that's a good answer, right? Because he was adopted by the daughter of Pharaoh, right?
Yeah.
So now he's part of the household.
Right.
So if he's under Pharaoh, and I just told you that once you got adopted, you can't really revoke it.
Right.
So it's like,
Wasn't he adopted by Jethro?
but I think it would be, because if you look at the chain of events, it says Pharaoh dies, and then he goes to live in Midian, and then that happens.
Yeah, because 3:1:2 talks about him tending Jethro's flocks. You know what I'm saying?
So it goes, Pharaoh died, and then he's in, what is it, Midian? That's the word? And then he basically gets adopted by Jethro. If you read that part, and then that's when God speaks to him. So very interesting. So if we look at the suzerain, there's a suzerain, and then if you guys remember, there's the vassals below them. So there's like a pyramid thing. So you have the main king on the top, and then he would have his lower kings on the bottom, and they would have these legal relationship with each other. So each vassal and suzerain are going to have a royal treaty, and that basically says, hey, I'm the suzerain, I've helped you out, I've given you all this stuff, and in return, you, the vassal, you have to follow these rules that I give you. So, you can't have any friendships with my enemies, you have to visit me once a year, you have to follow all these other rules, yada, yada, yada. Those are, the stipulations that they have to follow. But what we really haven't talked about is how he actually adopts the vassal. And then they start using language like father and son in a lot of these documents. So if we look at this treaty between that guy's name and Mariwaza, it says, the great king grabs me, Mariwaza, with his hand and said, when I will conquer the land of Mitanni, I shall not reject you. I shall make you my son. I will stand by to help in war and will make you sit on the throne of your father. The word which comes out of his mouth will not turn back. So the king, the suzerain, however you pronounce that name, he's adopting Mariwaza. So why do you think a suzerain would want to adopt a vassal?
So like continue their line. I guess.
Well, he already has a son. But why does he have to adopt a vassal king? Because remember, there's a suzerain, and then he has all these other vassals.
To like expand. No.
Because remember, it's not about having children, it's about legal stuff.
They take care of him.
Kind of the right direction, to take care of him, that's what she said. Let me see, what do I have after that? Oh, I have the answer. So why would a suzerain adopt a vassal? Well, it's to formalize a treaty between them. So now that they did that whole contract, then he adopts him, and that sets the contract, like, this is our relationship that we have now. And it legitimizes the vassal's rule. So since he's the son of the suzerain, now he has his authority from the suzerain. And then they have this kind of father-son relationship, but not in a lovey-dovey kind of way. More like, family type of thing. Like, he's my guy, you mess with him, now you gotta mess with me. That type of attitude. Not like this father-love emotional thing. It's more of a, what would you call it? Whatever the word is. There is a word, but I can't think of it. But, so they have this relationship with each other where the vassal, because think of a father-son relationship. The son is supposed to do what? If I'm the son of my dad, what am I supposed to do as a son? What am I expected to do?
Take care of him.
But let's not go like that in that direction. Just in general right now. Like right now, what do I have to do as a son?
Do what he says.
Exactly. Do as he says. And if I do as the father says, what do I get in return? he takes care of me, right? Gives me food, gives me protection, all this stuff. So that's exactly the relationship they have. I listen to him because he's the head honcho, and in return, he helps me out. That's that relationship. So then we see this in 2 Samuel when God speaks to David. Could somebody read this?
Thus says the Lord of hosts, I took you from the pasture, from following the sheep, to be a leader over my people Israel. And I have been with you everywhere you went. I have cut off all your enemies, and I will make for you a great name, like the name of the great ones who are on the earth. I will make a place for my people Israel, and I will plant them so that they can dwell in their own place. They will not tremble again, and wicked people will no longer afflict them as before. From the day that I appointed judges over my people Israel, I will give you rest from all your enemies, and the Lord declares that Hashem will build a house for you. When your days are filled and you lie down with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring after you, who will go out from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. When he does wrong, I will punish him with a rod of men and with blows of the human beings. But my loyal love shall not depart from him as I took it from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom shall endure forever before you, and your throne shall be established forever.
So we see that there is adoption language here where he says, I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. So God is adopting Solomon. But why is God adopting Solomon? What's the purpose of that? Does he need an heir? No, because he's God. So what's the purpose of God adopting Solomon the king? And it was actually a common practice in the ancient Near East where they would have the gods adopt the king as the son. So for example, in ancient Egypt, they would have this coronation for the new king, and he would have to go through purification rites, and then he'd be anointed, and they would give him that funny looking crown over there. And then they would say these 5 names of these different gods to, connect him with the gods, so that way he could look, divine? And then that would establish him as a mediator, that he was chosen by the gods to be a mediator for Egypt and the gods. And then he would become the embodiment of Horus. He would become the son of Ra. So he would be adopted by by Ra, and he would inherit their divine power and authority. But that is the whole point of why the gods would adopt the kings, because it established his authority. I have the authority to be king because I'm the son of the God, because he adopted me. So now I have him to back me up. Just like we talked about that father-son relationship. I am obedient to that guy, and he has my back. And that's what's going on with Solomon. So we have God, we have Solomon, and then he adopts him. And it's not that type of relationship. It's, again, that family type of thing. So God is backing up Solomon. Solomon has authority because of God, and now he's able to reign over Israel because God gives him that authority. So now when we have that idea in our heads, we can look at Yeshua and his baptism. So what kingly lineage does Yeshua have?
Supposed to be from David, right?
David, yeah. He has the Davidic line, right? Now, is it through his mother or his father?
Technically Joseph.
Well, it has to be Joseph.
Yeah.
But how can it be through Joseph if he's not Joseph's physical son? Because there's people out there that don't believe that Yeshua is a Messiah, and they'll say, well, he's not even Joseph's physical son, so he can't be king of Israel because he's not from the line of David. How do you answer that? So if you look at Code of Hammurabi, number 185, it says, if a man takes in adoption a young child at birth and they rear him, and that yearling will not be reclaimed. And there's a translation from this guy named Yarnan, and it says, if a man takes an infant out of his amniotic fluid for his sonship and has taken and has brought him up, that adopted child shall not be reclaimed. So back then, they would do this practice where if a woman was like a surrogate, kind of, she didn't want to have her kid. And I would come and I would take the kid. As she's giving birth to the kid, I would take him out. And then I would say, this is my son, while he's covered in all that fluid. And that was a common practice for them. And then once I do that, it's like, it's my son. Like, he's like my blood, my natural son. And nobody can take him away from me. So with Joseph, when Mary gave birth to Yeshua, and he took him up, he adopted Yeshua. So now he has the legal right to be from the line of David. And interestingly enough, amniotic fluid and seawater, they have the same salts with the same ion charges, which is pretty interesting. And there's also a bunch of other things that are similar. So if somebody were to be baptized, it'd be kind of like they were coming out of the womb. And we can see that supported when Yeshua gets baptized. Somebody read this for me. You want to read?
When all the people were being baptized, Yeshua was baptized too. And as he was praying, heaven was opened, and the Holy Spirit descended on him in bodily form like a dove. And a voice came from heaven, "You are my son, whom I love. With you I am well pleased."
So that's adoption language, right? He said, "You are my son." And it happened right after he gets baptized. So again, it's like him coming out of the womb and God retaking him. And then we don't really see Joseph mentioned anymore. So they all assume that he's dead by that time. And that's God reclaiming Yeshua as his son. But why does he have to do that? Why did he do it with Solomon? So we have Joseph, Yeshua, he gets adopted. And that because of that, he has access to the Davidic dynasty. But then God adopts Yeshua. Why? So that way he can become the Mashiach, he can have that status, and it legitimizes his authority. So now he talks about it all the time in the New Testament, that he has authority given to him through the Father. Now, why? Because he got adopted by God. And then we see in Luke, in that same, after that verse, right after it, it goes into the genealogy, and then it ends with Son of God. So it's showing you that he did get adopted by God afterwards, and then he goes into the wilderness, and then what does Satan tell Yeshua? He says, "If you are the Son of God, turn this rock into bread." So he was testing him, because he just got adopted by God to be the Son. But then how does that work with us? So if Yeshua gets adopted by God, how does that work with us if we're not natural-born citizens, right? How do we have access to the kingdom? And that's through adoption. So if we look at adoption in first century Rome, they had a very different purpose of why they would adopt. So usually it was practiced by the senatorial class. It's that guy in the toga. So the rich people, if they didn't have an heir, all their stuff and their title would be given away. So the state, the government, would take their stuff. They didn't really want that because they were very vain people. So back then also it was very expensive for them to have kids, just kind of like today. So it's very expensive to try to get a boy because there's no guarantee that you're going to have a boy. You can't control them. So the easier thing to do is to just pick one. So go out there and just pick a boy. And that also made girls less valuable. I'm not going to pick a girl. I need a boy because a boy makes sure that my stuff stays with my house. And then what will be the process of that? So I'm going to go and I'm going to pick a poor family. And I'm going to tell them, like, hey, I'm going to pick your son. And in exchange of that, I'm going to support you while he stays in your house. So he's going to be in their house. And then he's going to grow up. And then when he grows up, he's going to get adopted by them officially. And he's going to take the name of the senator that's adopting him. And this is something that actually happened in history. Augustus Caesar was not Augustus Caesar. He was Gaius Octavius. That was his actual name. But he was the nephew of Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar didn't have a son, and he needed an heir. So he adopts Augustus Octavius. And after he does that, he gets the name Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. And then later on, the Senate, they gave him Augustus Caesar. Augustus is actually a title. It means reverend one. So, but he got the name from his uncle because his uncle adopted him. That's something they would do back then. So the point of adoption in the first century was all about inheritance. You wanted to make sure that my stuff was safe, and that's why I would adopt somebody. So now we look at adoption in the New Testament. So before we get into Galatians, some background information. Galatia was from a Celtic background. Celtic is going to be like France, Germany, that region. And they were a very big problem for the Romans. So they would have these wars. They had the Gallic Wars for 8 years. And after the war was ended, they founded Galatia. And so all the Galatians are basically prisoners of war. They're all slaves left over from that war. And because they were slaves, they had no rights. And by no rights, I mean like if somebody wanted to have their way with you and you're a slave, you really can't say no, and that sucks. So, or, for example, Paul is talking to the Galatians because people are telling them that they have to be circumcised to be saved. But I'm a slave. And if I wanted to be circumcised, I would have to ask permission from my master. And if my master says no, and somebody just told me that I have to be saved, I have to be circumcised to be saved, I'm going to start freaking out because I can't. And then that's why Paul sends a letter to the Galatians to let them know that, look, that's not how that works, so you don't have to stress about it. Because everybody there is going to be mostly slaves. They don't have any rights. But then when you read Galatians 3:23 to 29, can somebody read that for me? Thank you.
Before the coming of this faith, we were held in custody under the law, locked up until the faith that was to come would be revealed. So the law was our guardian until Messiah came that we might be justified by faith. Now that this faith has come, we are no longer under a guardian.
So a lot of Christians, they read this part and they're like, see, the law is no longer needed because it was for a time and now we're free and I can eat bacon and I can go watch football games on Saturday or whatever. But if you look at the language, it's very similar to what we just talked about of adoption in the Rome, right? They would leave the kid with the family and then when the time was right, he would be officially adopted. So it's talking about adoption because the whole context of this chapter is about justification, not salvation. How are you justified to be part of the kingdom if you're not a natural born citizen? Adoption. God adopts you. So then it says, so in Messiah Yeshua, you are all children of God through faith. For all of you who are baptized in Messiah Yeshua have clothed yourself with Messiah. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, male or female. Why is he saying that? Because what did I just tell you? That back then, who would they adopt most of the times? Boys. So that's why he's saying that there's no difference between male or female. For you are all one in Messiah Yeshua. God doesn't care who you are. If you accept him and you want to turn your life around, he's going to take you in. So if you belong to Messiah, then you are Abraham's seed, heirs according to the promise. So you get adopted by God through Yeshua, and now you have access to the promise of Abraham, which is the land. And also you get salvation. And then also one thing that I pointed, he says, those who are baptized in Messiah Yeshua. So we see that baptism is a very important part of your conversion process, right? And we see that in Acts 10, 44 to 48. Can you read that? Yeah.
While Peter was still speaking these words, the Holy Spirit came on all who had heard the message. The circumcised believers who had come with Peter were astonished that the gift of the Holy Spirit had been poured out even on Gentiles, for they heard them speaking in tongues and praising God. Then Peter said, surely no one can stand in the way of their being baptized with water. They have received the Holy Spirit just as we have. So he ordered that they be baptized in the name of Yeshua Messiah. So then they asked Peter to stay with them for a few days.
So we see, because in Acts 10, we have Cornelius, who is a Gentile, but he's accepted by God because he's praying and doing tzedakah, doing charity, and he's accepted by God. And then Peter is shown through a vision that God accepts whoever, follows him, just like Abraham. And then we see the seal of the Holy Spirit go on these people, which means that God accepted them. And then right after they do that, then they get baptized so they can be born again. Like remember, Yeshua told Nicodemus he needed to be born again to enter the kingdom. He didn't really understand what he was talking about. This is what he means, to go through that process so that way you can be reaccepted by God. Because when you're born into this world, you're born under the master of the world, which at the time is Satan, until the time comes. So then if we go back to Galatians 4, can somebody read that? Can you read that, Andrew?
Now I say, for as long a time as the heir is a child, he is no different from a slave, although he is the master of everything. But he is under guardians and managers until the time set by his father. So also we, when we were children, we were enslaved under the elemental spirits of the world. But when the fullness of time came, God sent out his son, born of a woman, born under the law, in order that he might redeem those under the law, in order that we might receive the adoption. And because you are sons, God sent out the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying out, Abba, so that you are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, also an heir of God, through God.
Right, there you go. Romans 8, 9 to 17. Can somebody read that for me? Thank you.
But you are not in the flesh, but in the Spirit, if indeed the Spirit of God lives in you. But if anyone does not have the Spirit of Messiah, this person does not belong to him. But if Messiah is in you, the body is dead because of sin, but the Spirit is life because of righteousness. And if the Spirit of the one who raised Yeshua from the dead lives in you, the one who raised Messiah and Yeshua from the dead will also make alive your mortal bodies through his Spirit who lives in you. So then, brothers, we are For if you live according to the flesh, you are going to die. But if by the Spirit you put But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. For all those who are led by the Spirit of God, these are the sons of God. For you have not received the spirit of slavery leading up to fear again, but you have received the spirit of adoption, by whom we cry out, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself confirms to our spirit that we are children of God, and if children, also heirs, heirs of God and fellow heirs with Messiah, if indeed we suffer together with him, so that we may also be glorified together with him.
There's also Ephesians 1 that talks about how we're adopted. In Revelations, it talks about how we'll get a new name. Remember I talked about when people were adopted in Rome, you receive a new name. So those are all adoption languages. So what the Bible is trying to tell us in the New Testament, that you're an heir to God, sealed by his Spirit, heir to the inheritance. But what does that mean? If you're adopted by God, are you still obligated to follow him?
Yes.
Yeah, right? So you should still be following the commandments. You should be doing your best to, be a son of God. And you don't have to worry about anybody telling you that, you're not part of the kingdom or not. Because I see a lot of people that they go more into Judaism or they just leave and they go into Judaism because they want to be accepted. But they're never going to be accepted. So there's people that deny Yeshua, go try to become a Jew, and they're still not going to be accepted by them because for them, they're still Gentiles. So you don't have to worry about who accepts you. God is the one that accepts into the kingdom. Nobody can be a gatekeeper and just push you out. If you really like the teaching or you're more interested in learning more about it, Rico has a more in-depth teaching in his website. That's where I got most of this information from. It's pretty good. I think it's 6 parts. Pretty good information. He also has the book of Galatians. If you wanted to learn more about that, I would recommend it. Does anybody have any questions?
When you showed us that earlier, adoption thing, the Suzer and Bassel,
Yeah.
Where were they from? What were they?
Oh, those kings?
Yeah.
I think it was Assyrian. They're going to be Assyrian tablets. Was it Hittites? Might be Hittites. Might be Hittites. Okay. Anything else? No? So we can just cut it. Yeah.